Good morning for all of you here on the West Coast of the United States, and good afternoon or good evening for those in other parts of the country or around the world. Welcome to the second day of the 2020 Global Philanthropy Forum. I'm Jonathan Visbal, Chairman of the Board of World Affairs, and I'd like to add my welcome to all of you. As we experience extreme weather events more frequently, like the wildfires that have ravaged California, we must seek to work together around the globe to mitigate climate change. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into solutions to the challenges of climate change, and we start with a conversation between two women who are committed to making a difference on the issues of climate justice. Wanjiru Maathai, daughter of Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai, who is in Kenya and is Regional Director for Africa of the World Resources Institute, and former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, who is in Ireland and currently leader of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. Please join me in giving them both a virtual round of applause.
President Mary Robinson, so wonderful to be having this conversation with you. It is delightful to be here today, and thank you to the Global Philanthropy Forum for the opportunity to participate in this briefing about, or at least this discussion about climate justice, an issue that you have taught me a whole lot about, Mary. I just wanted to start by reflecting on the fact that these are really interesting times. I came in to the Vice President and Regional Director role at World Resources Institute just at the end of last year. And what a time it's been already. Interesting times indeed. We have the COVID pandemic that has completely reshaped how we think about the future and how urgent it is that we think about the future. We also have the global economic downturn that is epic, and you know a lot about how to drive economies and how to bring out the confidence of populations at times like this. And then I'm also inspired quite a bit by the Black Lives Matter movement, because that has been a movement that has sharpened and reminded us and triggered a global reckoning about race relations, equity, justice, including climate justice, and the general anti-Black sentiment around the world. And it's important that we consider that these are the issues that climate justice is all about. And as I reflected on the fact that we were going to be speaking today, climate change, of course, remains the big issue of our time. But I've started thinking about what does that mean for our generation as we step into the leadership. For Africa, we know that the poverty levels unprecedented, agricultural productivity sluggish, and has been such a big part of what is going on with the pandemic and the impacts here in Africa. But one of the things that inspires me, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, Mary, is the fact that Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world, and certainly the youngest. I surprise myself every time when I realize that Africa's average median population, 19 years old. That is amazing. What is the promise that we have for these young people, men and women, and gender as an inclusive a parameter? You've been talking about all of this. So I'm really looking forward to hearing where you're thinking now in terms of justice and how we make and build hope in the minds of these young people. Just delighted to be sharing this stage with you today.
Well, thank you, Wanjiru. And, you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, I came into this climate world with a mentor, your mother, Wangari Maathai, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for her work on environment and peace, particularly in your native Kenya. And she was a wonderful friend, as you know. And now it's great that I'm also learning from you, but also in an intergenerational conversation with you, if I can put it that way, which is very nice. And let's start with Africa, because I think that's important. But I would like, actually, if I may, very briefly, because I've been thinking a lot about climate justice, I'd like to reframe, because I don't think you've heard me on this, it's relatively recent, that I've come to actually 5 layers of injustice that mean we have to have a climate justice approach. And they're very relevant even to Black Lives Matter in a way that I'll say. Because the first injustice is that climate change disproportionately affects the poorest countries, the poorest communities, small island states. And that's a very racial mix. That's black and brown people. That's the Black Lives Matter in its own way. And COVID has shown this in a particular way. So that's the first layer. The second layer is gender, that within that, women, with their different social roles, with their lack of the same access to land, to rights, to assets, and yet they have to put food on the table. They have to go further in drought for water and firewood, etc. So that's the gender dimension. The third dimension is the one the children have reminded us of, the intergenerational injustice. And you talked about Africa being a very young continent, and African voices need to bring out that intergenerational injustice as well. And the fourth layer is one that is particularly relevant. It's the different pathways to development. The industrialized countries, like my country, Ireland, and the United States, built their economies on fossil fuel. And now we've got to urgently wean ourselves off fossil fuel. And that's our issue, and we're not doing it well enough or urgently enough. But developing countries have to bring their people out of poverty. Before Paris, and I was the special envoy at the time of the UN, they wanted to do this in as green a way as possible. But they said, we will need the investment, we will need the training, we will need the skills in order to do it. And we haven't shown that solidarity enough. So that's another injustice, if you like. And the fifth injustice, which in many ways probably was the strongest for your mother, Wangari, but I came to relatively late, is the injustice to nature herself. The lack of, the loss of diversity, the extinction of species, what we're doing to the ecosystems that support us. Now, all of those in combination are highly relevant to Africa for the reasons that you gave, and yet you're also positive, as I would be. I see Africa as being the continent with the great potential this century. And I see, to be honest, for the first time, I see the European Union actually recognizing that. The European Union, with its Green New Deal, with its policy on biodiversity, and with its farm to fork to farm, policy, is it's very relevant. And there's going to be, as you know, a very important AU-EU summit in October, where somehow we've got to bring these two continents together in a much better way.
Lovely, Mary. I couldn't agree more. And maybe even more urgent is, how do we actually build the trust that has been so lost, especially because of, as you've mentioned, in the pathways to development, what is perceived by many African countries as an inauthentic engagement with Africa, and the fact that we are still talking about adaptation, we're still talking about loss and damage, we're still talking about stranded assets. How do we give Africa the signals that are needed so that she can begin to authentically prepare? Because I think one of the biggest disappointments, and it's still also a great opportunity for COP26 and the justice process, is how we signal that Africa is a genuine partner in the climate discussions, and that what we do, and especially now with COVID, what we do with our natural resources matters. But we need to have the technical support that is necessary to make that transition. And that, for some reason, Mary, has been so difficult. And even as a student of the climate process, I'm still trying to get on top of it. I find it very difficult to answer the question, why? So what will we need to do differently is what I keep asking myself. How can we be authentic in this engagement? And I would love to hear some of your thinking on that. And then I love what you said about the youth population in Africa. We have a population that is rearing to go. I often say that if we don't have real opportunities as the generation that they are following to give them the real support they need, we have to get out of the way. And they are absolutely prepared to do whatever it takes. But what does real engagement mean? I mean, where are the resources to help those who are creating businesses around nature-based solutions so that they can begin to be part of the climate solution, to be part of the biodiversity solution, but also earn a living and create jobs for themselves? That's the sort of hope we're looking for. Is it possible? What do you think?
Well, I certainly understand when you say there has to be trust. And in my view, trust has to be earned. You earn trust by your actions, not by promises that you fail to deliver on. And for too long, that has been the case. And there's been an arrogance of power in the relationship between the European Union and the African continent. But I do honestly think there is a change. The change is happening within the European Union, in the leadership now on a genuine commitment to a Green New Deal, to a biodiversity strategy, to reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, to a very different approach. And that is being mirrored by real discussion about how to build resilience in African production of food and agriculture. And that's very important for the continent, but also energy, access to renewable energy, and how this can be greatly augmented, and how there can be a real partnership, as you said, not a top-down from a so-called leader continent talking to a smaller brother or something. No, a real respectful working together. And then I think we can make a lot of progress. I think that philanthropy can do a lot in helping to support projects for resilience, projects for food systems, for nature-based solutions, for women-led projects. I worked with some philanthropies, the Oak Foundation, my friend Heather Grady, who worked with me and who is now with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors in San Francisco, and the Climate Resilience Fund. We worked on climate justice, meaning trying to get the money to women on the ground who are building their communities. It is amazing how little gets to that cohort, and yet they are doing so much. And they're doing it despite the fact that they don't have even sometimes the land rights, and yet they come together as a group and they fight back and they're doing it. And that was what I wrote about in my book on climate justice. So we need philanthropy to see how to support resilience building and access to energy, clean energy, a lot of it off-grid, but good quality energy.
I agree. That's so important. You mentioned agriculture, Mary. I recently read some statistics from Agra that agriculture is responsible close to 70% of the jobs on the continent. That's a lot. And so the weight on that sector, no wonder we are focused so much on agriculture and the fact that it is being interfered with, and the supply chains for agriculture and food production are so critical in this recovery. And I agree. I think philanthropy has an interesting role to play. And sometimes I've started to wonder whether there's the actual role where the investments and supporting some of these very important activities on the ground, but also in sending signals and supporting some of the democratization process, the political economy side of this discussion. Because for us on the continent, sometimes you see people doing so much good work, but the decisions are made within the context of this political economy that is sometimes extremely frustrating. We'll say the right things, but we need to engage. I wonder what, in your opinion, are some of the winning strategies? You know a lot about winning political economy strategies, so that we can get young people both standing up for what they believe, because that's one of the things that I continue to advocate with youth leadership. What does it mean to stand up for what you can be, but also that philanthropy supports some of these areas? The role of the political economy in climate justice movements. What would you think?
Yeah, it's really very important. I mean, you mentioned earlier the median age in Africa being 19, but the median age of African leaders is somewhere in the 60s, isn't it? So that's a problem. Right. We need young leaders to be given the opportunity to show that leadership, which I very much agree with you is there. We're seeing it in culture. We're seeing it in now the online, the websites, the innovative, including in your own Kenya, very innovative work being done. And we need to see more of this. And we do need space for civil society to be more involved in the decisions affecting the country, so that there is a sense, and it's kind of that political leaders mustn't distrust their own civil society and think that they're somehow the opposition. They're not. They just want to engage. And also political leaders need to listen more to their private sector. I've heard a number of really good private sector African champions saying, if only our government would listen, if only our government. So these are, I think, some of the ways in which space needs to be opened up. And philanthropy has a role because it's independent, because it's flexible, it can move quite quickly, it can adapt to, and we need to learn the lessons from COVID. And I think there are four, and I'll tell them very briefly, four lessons that are really important. The first lesson is that collective human behavior matters. It's the only thing protecting us from the virus. And it will matter when we need collective behavior on climate, like the collective consumer behavior in the richer parts of the world to consume less, produce less, consume less, waste less food in particular, all of that. Secondly, government matters. And this is really going to be very important. The quality of government in leading countries, including African countries, out of this problem. And I'm very glad that African-led countries have been doing particularly well. And I hope that will be noted in this conference. And the third issue is that science matters. We've listened to the health science, but we also need now to listen to the climate scientists in a similar way. This climate crisis is absolutely looming and urgent, not going away. And we're somehow fixated now on COVID, as we have to be. And you have a locust problem, as I know, in your part of Africa and elsewhere that's quite severe. And the final thing that matters, and it's one that I think climate justice wants to really inspire, is compassion. When everybody is suffering, and I don't mean we're suffering equally, actually COVID exacerbates inequalities. So we're not suffering equally, but we're all somehow changed and affected and different and suffering a bit. And that creates empathy. And I'm hoping that there will be a real empathy and solidarity going forward, because without it, we're not going to be able to create the trust that you're talking about. We absolutely need that trust, and we must create it.
Wow, the empathy, such an important thread that is cutting through so much of what we're talking about these days. And you're absolutely right about COVID. COVID has somehow, we've been saying science matters in climate forever. I mean, I remember an inconvenient truth, and that was enough, more than enough science in such a compelling way presented to us. But I know for certain that it should have, in many ways, the parallels we draw from the fact that COVID has been in the places where I think unified action has been demonstrated and countries have shown great progress in trying to address this issue, has been guided by science. And I think that it is one of the few times now you will hear quite a bit in Africa people say, the way our leaders have dealt so unified and committed to COVID, they should deal the same way with all these other issues that they seem to ignore. Somehow the political economy clicked with COVID and they were able to address this issue. I can speak for Kenya and a lot of the countries around us that we address this issue with great focus, and there was a lot of discussion, transparency in terms of the discussion, but the governance issues underlying the resources that are spent, we see still some of the old discussions around transparency and corruption that we need to get a handle of, and those are the same ones that are holding us back, I believe, in all of these other issues. But I have to say, the fact that we've been saying science matters is so starkly demonstrated by COVID, because it was about listening to the scientists. And many times we are still in curfew here, and many times the president would come every month and tell us that this curfew will be extended for another 30 days because the science is not on our side. And I just think, great, can we use that same intellect and political economy when we are addressing issues that matter, like infrastructure and urbanization and the protection of vital landscapes on our continent? I hope that we can continue to drum up that so that our leaders see that we really appreciate and things actually work when we use the talent, the deep talent that is in the country, and rely on science in as much as possible. So that's such I mean, we could talk forever, Mary. I love this, and I hope we can continue. I really look forward to reaching out and seeing how we can continue to work together as we have in the past. My mother was very proud of the partnership you shared, the sisterhood, she called it. And I hope that we can continue with a lot of the leaders that you have inspired as well.
Well, thank you, Anjira. And I also have great faith in young people today. And I think you mentioned over and over science matters. And I wanted to mention over and over government matters. Government has to be service to the people of the country, not the corruption, not the cronyism, not the problems that continue in lots of parts of the world, not just in Africa. But, government matters. And maybe coronavirus is a time for a reflection for all of us. And we can learn lessons that will be really important for climate justice. And I'm so glad that the children use the chant of climate justice and call us out. We want a safe future for everyone. I must tell you a secret, Wanjira. Yesterday, I had my 7th grandchild. So I have these 7 grandchildren. I have 2 boys and 3 boys and 4 girls. 7 grandchildren. And I'm so happy about it, but so concerned about their future. So that drives me as well. As I know your mother was very driven in her passion, as you are. So it was great to talk with you.
Thank you. May you continue to be abundantly blessed. Those grandchildren indeed are blessings. I must say that the next session, Building Resilience Through Women's Leadership, will continue this important conversation that we've had, and it will begin after a very short break at 8:30. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. That was lovely. Yeah. Lovely. I wish we had longer, but there we are.
I know.